Marcus had spent his entire life working toward the success he now enjoyed. Growing up in a cramped apartment with a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for him, he learned early on that nothing would come easy. There were no shortcuts, no safety nets, only relentless effort and a determination to rise above the limitations that society often placed on people like him. So he did what needed to be done. He studied harder than anyone else, worked longer hours, and climbed the corporate ladder step by step until he could finally afford the life he had always dreamed of. His home, a sleek, modern two-story house with a meticulously landscaped backyard and a pristine in-ground pool, was more than just property. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome, a testament to the sacrifices he and his mother had made. It was proof that he belonged. But not everyone saw it that way. From the moment he moved into the neighborhood, Marcus noticed the subtle ways his presence was questioned. Some neighbors greeted him with forced smiles, while others barely acknowledged him at all. It was a quiet, lingering doubt in their eyes, as if they were trying to figure out how he had ended up here. But no one embodied that entitled attitude more than his next-door neighbor, Karen. The first time Marcus saw her lounging in his pool, he thought it had to be a mistake. He had just returned from a morning run, sweat still cooling on his skin, when he spotted a blonde woman floating on an inflatable lounger, oversized sunglasses shielding half her face. She looked completely at ease, as if she belonged there, as if he were the one trespassing. He stopped in his tracks, trying to make sense of what he was seeing before finally calling out, "Excuse me, what are you doing in my backyard?" Karen barely glanced at him, lazily swiping at her phone. "Oh, this pool is amazing," she said, ignoring the question entirely. "I needed this today." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "You needed to trespass into my yard and use my pool?" She let out an exaggerated sigh and finally turned her head. "I assumed you wouldn't mind," she said, lifting her sunglasses just enough to give him a disinterested look. The fence was open. Marcus clenched his jaw. The fence had not been open, at least not before she got there. But before he could argue, Karen climbed out of the water, grabbed a towel from his patio chair, and strolled back toward her own yard without a care in the world. That was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Marcus caught Karen in his pool more and more often. Sometimes she slipped in when he was at work. Other times, she brazenly floated under the afternoon sun, acting like she owned the place. Every time he confronted her, she brushed him off with dismissive excuses. "Oh, I thought this was a neighborhood perk," she'd say with a laugh. Or worse, when he lost his patience and demanded she leave, she would play the victim. "Wow," she'd huff, shaking her head. "You don't have to be so aggressive." Marcus knew exactly what she was doing. She was testing him, waiting to see how far she could push before he either snapped or backed down. And worst of all, she knew that if the police got involved, he would be the one at risk, not her. That realization burned in his chest. He had spent his entire life proving himself, working twice as hard to be seen as equal, only to be met with this, someone who felt entitled to what was his, simply because she assumed he didn't belong there. One afternoon, he arrived home early to find not just Karen, but two of her friends lounging by the pool, sipping wine, their belongings scattered across his patio furniture like they had booked a day at a private resort. That was the moment he decided enough was enough. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and started recording. Karen turned at the sound, her smirk widening when she saw him. "Oh, Marcus, you're home early," she drawled. "You should have texted. We would have saved you a drink." His grip tightened around his phone. "Get out!" Karen sighed dramatically, lifting her glass. "Why are you always so uptight? It's just a pool." "No," Marcus said, his voice low, controlled. "It's my pool, and I'm done with this." Karen exchanged a look with her friends before turning back to him, her smirk deepening. "Well, maybe you shouldn't have such a nice house," she mused. "People are always talking about privilege, but let's be real. You lucked into this place. How many people like you live here? Do you really think you belong?" Marcus inhaled sharply, every muscle in his body going rigid. She had finally said the quiet part out loud. Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, and what are you going to do if I don't leave?" she asked, swirling the wine in her glass. "Call the cops? You know how that ends for your kind." A heavy silence fell over the backyard. The smug amusement on Karen's face told him that she expected him to fold, to accept the unspoken rules of the world they lived in. But what she didn't know, what she would learn soon enough, was that Marcus had spent his entire life fighting for what was his. And this time, he wasn't backing down. Marcus had spent years mastering the art of restraint. He had learned early in life that the world often judged him before he even spoke, that the wrong reaction, the wrong tone, the wrong expression could turn him from a man into a threat. His success had not been handed to him. It had been earned through discipline, through calculated patience, through knowing when to push back and when to walk away. But standing in his own backyard, staring at a woman who had just told him to his face that he didn't belong, he felt something shift inside him. Karen's words hung in the air, thick with entitlement, laced with the confidence of someone who had never once questioned her own place in the world. She looked at him not with fear, not with remorse, but with amusement, as if she had won some unspoken game. And maybe, for a moment, she thought she had. Because men like Marcus, black men who had fought for every inch of respect they had, were expected to let things go. To swallow the disrespect, to prioritize survival over justice, to walk away and count themselves lucky that things hadn't escalated. But Marcus wasn't walking away this time. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the anger settle into something sharper, something more useful. He knew better than to engage in a battle he couldn't win, not in a system that had never been designed for his protection. He had seen enough headlines, heard enough stories to know that a single call from Karen, a carefully crafted lie about feeling unsafe, could turn his own home into a crime scene. So he didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he simply met her gaze, his voice calm, steady. "You're right," he said. "Calling the cops wouldn't work." Karen's smirk wavered for the briefest moment. "But don't worry," Marcus continued, turning on his heel. "I have a better plan." And just like that, he walked away. Karen expected a fight. She expected him to argue, to raise his voice, to give her exactly what she needed to play the victim. But what she didn't expect, what she couldn't prepare for, was for Marcus to outthink her. That night, Marcus got to work. He wasn't looking for revenge. Revenge was temporary, fleeting. What he wanted was something far more powerful: control. He spent hours researching, reaching out to experts, setting plans into motion. And when he finally had everything in place, he smiled to himself, knowing that Karen's reign over his space was about to come to an end. Days passed without incident. Karen, emboldened by what she assumed was his surrender, continued to treat his backyard like her personal retreat. She lounged in his pool, invited friends over, drank wine on his patio furniture as if she had earned the right to be there. But what she didn't know, what she would soon find out, was that Marcus had been preparing for this moment. And then, one afternoon, the pieces fell into place. The sun was high, the air thick with the scent of sunscreen and entitlement. Karen and her friends were sprawled out by the pool, laughter echoing through his backyard, completely unaware that today was different. That this time, Marcus was waiting. He stepped outside, sunglasses shielding his eyes, hands in his pockets. Karen barely reacted at first, too engrossed in her conversation. But when one of her friends nudged her, whispering under her breath, Karen turned and froze. Because this time, Marcus wasn't alone. Flanking him were two Rottweilers, their massive forms poised like statues, their eyes locked onto the uninvited guests in the pool. Titan and Havoc moved in perfect synchronization, their presence alone enough to make even the boldest person reconsider their choices. They didn't bark, they didn't lunge, they simply waited. Karen's confidence cracked. "Marcus," she said, attempting a nervous laugh. "This is a little dramatic, don't you think?" Marcus tilted his head. "Oh, I don't know. You love this pool so much I figured I should introduce you to the new lifeguards." Karen's breath hitched as Titan took a single step forward. Her friends scrambled, slipping against the wet concrete, trying to gather their belongings with shaking hands. The atmosphere had changed. The game was over. Marcus let the moment stretch, let her feel the weight of the reality she had ignored for so long. Then, in a voice so casual it almost sounded friendly, he spoke the words that sealed her fate. Lifeguard duty. The reaction was immediate. Titan and Havoc surged forward, not into the pool, not attacking, but cutting off any possible escape route. The women shrieked, one losing her balance and landing with a splash. Karen pressed herself against the edge, hands gripping the slick surface, her once smug expression now replaced with something far more satisfying. Panic. Marcus leaned against the patio railing, taking his time, letting her sit in the consequences of her choices. You know, Karen, he mused, watching as she struggled to compose herself, I was starting to wonder if you'd ever take me seriously. Karen's breathing was ragged. Call them off. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Oh, now you want rules? Now you want respect? Her silence was answer enough. He let her stew a little longer before finally giving a low whistle. Instantly, Titan and Havoc retreated, their job done. But the lesson had already been delivered. Karen and her friends scrambled out of the pool, soaked and humiliated, their hands still trembling as they grabbed their things. Karen turned to him one last time. Her lips parted as if searching for some way to regain control. But there was nothing left to say. Marcus had already won. And as she hurried out of his yard for what he knew would be the last time, Marcus exhaled slowly, savoring the moment. Because this wasn't just about a pool. This was about respect. And he had just taken it back. Karen should have learned her lesson. She should have walked away, humiliated but wiser, understanding that Marcus was not a man to be pushed, not a man who would let her entitlement dictate his reality. But people like Karen, people who had spent their entire lives convinced they were untouchable, never learned the easy way. They always believed there was one more card to play, one more way to twist the world in their favor. And so, instead of accepting defeat, she doubled down. It was nearly midnight when Marcus's phone buzzed, an alert flashing across his screen. Motion detected. Backyard. He sat up instantly, the cool night air filtering through the open window as he reached for his phone and tapped into the live feed. His jaw tightened. There she was. Karen, crouched by the pool, her silhouette just barely visible under the soft glow of the backyard lights. But she wasn't lounging this time. She wasn't sipping wine or laughing with friends. No, tonight she was alone. And in her hand, glinting under the moonlight, was a box cutter. Marcus exhaled slowly, watching as she dragged the blade along the pool liner, a pathetic act of vengeance. She couldn't use the pool, so she would destroy it. That was the thing about people like her. They didn't just want to win, they wanted others to lose. If she couldn't enjoy what Marcus had, then neither could he. She was so caught up in her pettiness that she never noticed the two shadows slipping from the darkness, moving with the kind of silent precision that only trained protectors possessed. Titan and Havoc had been watching too. Through the security camera, Marcus saw the moment Karen realized she wasn't alone, the sharp intake of breath, the way her shoulders tensed, the hesitation in her grip as she looked up and locked eyes with two sets of gleaming, unblinking eyes staring right back at her. Then came the growl. Low, menacing, a sound that didn't just warn, it promised. Karen spun around so fast she nearly tripped over herself, eyes darting toward the fence, her mind racing for an escape. But there was none. Titan and Havoc weren't attacking. They didn't need to. They blocked her exit with calculated ease, their massive forms moving just enough to remind her that any attempt to run might end badly. Marcus leaned back against his pillows, phone in hand, watching the scene unfold. He had to admit, he was impressed. Karen had done a lot of stupid things, but breaking onto his property again after what happened last time, that took a special kind of arrogance. He took his time, stretching, rolling his shoulders before finally, leisurely, making his way downstairs. By the time he stepped outside, Karen was backed up against the oak tree, her chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. Titan and Havoc sat at the base, their bodies coiled, ready. They weren't barking. They weren't lunging. But their message was clear. Stay put. Marcus tilted his head, letting the moment linger. Then, he spoke. "You know, Karen," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets, "you really don't know when to quit." Karen flinched at his voice, her fingers trembling around the box cutter before she quickly shoved it into the pocket of her jacket. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. Marcus smirked. "Oh, so you weren't just trying to vandalize my pool?" Karen shut her mouth, realizing there was no excuse that could save her now. Marcus lifted his phone, tapping the screen. "Don't worry, though. It's all on camera." Karen's face paled. "Marcus, please," she tried, her voice shaking. I wasn't thinking." He let out a short laugh, stepping closer, watching her shrink against the tree. "Oh, you were thinking," he corrected. "You were thinking about how to punish me for not bowing to you. You were thinking about how to remind me that you were supposed to be the one in control." His voice dropped lower. "But you don't run this neighborhood, Karen. And you damn sure don't run me." A flash of red and blue lights cut through the night as a squad car rolled up to the curb. Marcus hadn't even needed to call. His security system had already sent the footage directly to the authorities. The officers stepped out, taking in the scene, Karen, trembling, caught in the act. Marcus, calm, unbothered. And two massive dogs sitting in disciplined silence, waiting for their next command. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair, let out a low whistle. "Ma'am," he said, pulling out his notepad. "Care to explain what exactly you're doing here?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. She turned to Marcus, her eyes pleading. He arched a brow. "You said it yourself last time," he reminded her. "The cops listen to some people in this neighborhood." Karen's face twisted in rage, but it didn't matter anymore. The moment the officers saw the security footage, the moment the evidence was laid out, she was done. They pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and for the first time, Karen didn't look like the entitled woman who had strutted into his backyard without a care. She looked small, powerless. As they led her toward the squad car, Marcus let out a slow breath, watching the last remnants of Karen's control crumble into nothing. And as the doors shut behind her, as the car pulled away, he turned to Titan and Havoc, giving a soft whistle. "Come on, boys," he said, scratching behind their ears as they followed him back inside. "I think we've had enough excitement for one night." The neighborhood was quiet again, peaceful, and this time it would stay that way. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture every expression, every shift of emotion. Concerned citizens filled the seats, some leaning forward, others whispering among themselves. In the center of it all sat Karen, her posture stiff, her hands clenched together on the defense table. Gone was the smug arrogance, the entitlement that once dripped from her every word. Now her face was hollow, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. But there was none, not this time. Across from her, Marcus sat tall and composed, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. He had spent years working for everything he had endured the subtle and not-so-subtle barriers placed in his way, had fought to earn his place in a world that often tried to tell him he didn't belong. But today, in this moment, the truth was undeniable. Karen wasn't the one in control anymore. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that cut like steel, stood before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, pacing slowly, letting the weight of the case settle over the room. "This is not a complicated trial. The facts are clear. The defendant, Karen Mitchell, trespassed onto private property not once, not twice, but repeatedly. She harassed, humiliated, and threatened a man simply because she believed she could. And when she was finally confronted with consequences, instead of learning from her mistakes, she escalated. She broke into his backyard in the dead of night, armed with a weapon, with the full intent to destroy something that did not belong to her." Karen flinched at the word weapon, her mouth opening slightly as if to object, but her lawyer placed a firm hand on her arm. He knew there was nothing to say. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor turned to Marcus. "Admiral Lawson," she addressed him formally, even though he had told her she didn't need to use his title. But she did anyway, because in this courtroom, respect wasn't optional. "Can you walk us through the events of that night?" Marcus nodded, his voice steady as he recounted everything. The security alert, the live footage of Karen slashing at his pool liner, the way Titan and Havoc had cornered her before she could escape. The jury listened intently, some shaking their heads in disbelief. And when he got to the part about the police arriving, about the officers pulling up to find Karen clinging to a tree in sheer terror, the corner of the prosecutor's mouth twitched ever so slightly, as if even she couldn't believe the poetic justice of it all. "And at any point," she asked, stepping closer, "did you threaten Ms. Mitchell? Did you lay a hand on her? Did you use violence against her in any way?" Marcus met Karen's gaze for the first time. "No," he said simply. The prosecutor nodded. "Because unlike the defendant, you understood that power is not about control. It's about accountability." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's lawyer stood, clearing his throat. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge said without hesitation, barely sparing him a glance. The prosecutor turned back to the jury. "The truth is, if roles were reversed, if the victim in this case was not a black man, but someone who looked like Ms. Mitchell, we wouldn't be here today. There wouldn't be questions about whether she was afraid or whether she made a simple mistake. She would be held accountable. And today, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what we must do." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood, unfolding a sheet of paper with deliberate care. "On the charge of criminal trespassing," he said, voice steady, "we find the defendant guilty." Karen's breath hitched. "On the charge of attempted vandalism, we find the defendant guilty." Her hands curled into fists. "On the charge of harassment, we find the defendant guilty." Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying finally begin to lift. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked down at Karen with an expression of sheer disappointment. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her voice sharp, "you have spent months terrorizing your neighbor, believing that you were above the law, believing that your actions would never have consequences. But today, you learn what so many before you have refused to accept: there are consequences, and privilege does not protect you here." Karen's shoulders shook as the judge delivered the sentence. 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation and a hefty fine. A collective gasp filled the room. A white woman going to jail for harassing a black homeowner? It was almost unheard of. Karen turned to Marcus, her face twisted in desperation, in disbelief. "Marcus," she whimpered, as if suddenly remembering his name. "Please." He tilted his head slightly, watching her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, just enough so that only she could hear. "You called the cops on me," he murmured, voice almost amused. "Guess they finally listened." Karen's face crumpled, but it didn't matter anymore. The officers were already stepping forward, already pulling her to her feet, already snapping the handcuffs around her wrists. She struggled, but no one cared. She had run out of second chances. As she was led out of the courtroom, the cameras flashed, reporters shouting, headlines already forming. The internet would have a field day with this. And Marcus, he was free. His home was his again. His peace was restored. And Karen? She would have plenty of time to reflect on what happens when entitlement meets the one thing it can never outrun: justice. The story of Marcus and Karen was never just about a pool. It was about power, about entitlement, about the quiet, insidious ways some people believe they have the right to take up space that does not belong to them. Karen had trespassed, not because she was desperate for a swim, but because she believed, deep down, that Marcus didn't truly deserve what he had. She had spent months trying to prove that, weaponizing privilege, twisting reality, and threatening consequences, that she thought only he would suffer. But in the end, it wasn't Marcus who paid the price. It was her. Justice, when it finally arrived, was swift and unrelenting. The courtroom had become a battleground, not just for Marcus, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like a guest in their own success. Karen, who had once carried herself with the smug certainty that she would never be held accountable, now sat trembling as the weight of the verdict sank in. Guilty. 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 Each word was a hammer striking the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. The walls that had allowed her to believe she could do as she pleased without consequence. Marcus sat quietly, watching, absorbing the moment. He had spent a lifetime learning to navigate spaces that weren't built for him, learning to swallow his anger, to smile through disrespect, to choose his battles carefully. This had been one of those battles. And now, finally, it was over. He didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel the need to gloat. There was no joy in watching someone ruin themselves, but there was satisfaction in knowing that for once the system had worked. The judge's voice had been clear, unwavering. Karen would serve 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation. The fine she would pay would be enough to make her feel the consequences long after her sentence was over. She would not walk away from this unscathed, would not be allowed to simply disappear and reinvent herself as if nothing had happened. The internet had already ensured that. Her face, her name, her actions, they were burned into the public consciousness now, a cautionary tale for those who still believed the world would always bend to their will. As Karen was led away, Marcus felt something inside him settle. Not just relief, but something deeper. Vindication. The kind that comes when a lifetime of unspoken injustices finally meets a reckoning. He thought about the countless times he had been told to let things go, to ignore the microaggressions, to not make waves. But had he done that this time, had he ignored what was happening in his own backyard, Karen would still be lounging in his pool, still laughing at his frustration, still daring him to do something about it. The truth was, people like Karen thrived in spaces where no one pushed back. They relied on silence, on hesitation, on the carefully cultivated fear that had been ingrained in people like Marcus for generations. But silence was no longer an option. He had chosen to fight, not with rage, not with reckless emotion, but with intelligence, with patience, with strategy. And that had made all the difference. Walking out of the courthouse, the sun warm on his face, he felt lighter than he had in months. Reporters called out his name, asking for a statement, but he wasn't interested in the spectacle. He didn't need to explain himself. The story spoke for itself. Back home, he stood on his patio, looking out at the pool that had once been a battleground. The water was still, peaceful, undisturbed. Titan and Havoc lay at his feet, their tails thumping lazily against the deck. They had done their job. And now so had he. Karen was gone. The battle was won. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus could finally, truly relax. Because this was his home, his space, his victory, and no one could take that away from him again. The story of Marcus and Karen is more than just a tale of one man reclaiming his personal space. It is a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the power of standing up for oneself in the face of entitlement and injustice. It highlights a struggle that far too many people experience. The fight to be respected in spaces they have rightfully earned. Marcus's journey is a reminder that privilege, when unchecked, can become a weapon used to undermine those who don't fit a narrow, prejudiced idea of who belongs. But what makes this story so powerful is not just the injustice, it's the way Marcus chose to respond. Instead of resorting to anger or violence, Marcus outmaneuvered Karen with strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve. He didn't just push back, he exposed the entitlement for what it was. He turned the power dynamics on their head, showing that intelligence and preparation will always outweigh arrogance and manipulation. His decision to document everything, to use his resources wisely, and to approach the situation with clear-headed determination ensured that justice was not only served, but also witnessed by the world. This is a story of empowerment, of refusing to let others dictate your worth, of refusing to be made to feel like a guest in your own home, your own success, your own space. Too often, people are told to ignore these daily indignities, to let them slide, to not make trouble. But silence allows oppression to persist. Marcus proved that standing up for yourself doesn't mean you have to play their game. It means playing smarter, knowing your rights, and ensuring that those who try to take advantage of you face consequences they never expected. Karen's downfall was not just about her trespassing into a pool. It was about her trespassing into the life of someone she thought she could control. Her entitlement was built on the belief that Marcus could not fight back without losing. But Marcus showed that the rules have changed. We live in a world where actions have consequences, where social accountability is real, and where no one is above the law simply because they've always been allowed to get away with bad behavior. Beyond Karen, this story speaks to a larger truth. It calls attention to the ways racism and privilege manifest in everyday interactions. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How many times have people been forced to tolerate what Marcus endured? How many individuals have felt powerless because they knew the system was not designed to protect them? And most importantly, how do we change that? The answer is simple: by refusing to be silent, by holding people accountable, and by ensuring that these moments are not ignored, but confronted. Marcus's story resonates because it represents a shift in power. It is a message to every person who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or made to feel like they don't belong. It is proof that you can fight back without sacrificing your dignity. It is proof that intelligence, preparation, and strategic action will always be more powerful than entitlement and intimidation. This is why we must continue telling stories like Marcus's, because they are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger fight for justice, respect, and the right to exist in spaces without fear of being questioned or undermined. They are reminders that the battle for equality is not just fought in courtrooms or protests, but in everyday encounters, in neighborhoods, workplaces, and personal lives. If you believe in the fight for justice, if you believe that no one should have to prove their worth just to be treated with basic respect, then this is just the beginning. Join us in amplifying these voices, in exposing the truth, in ensuring that no one is alone in their struggle. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight and be part of the movement that refuses to back down. Because the fight for equality is far from over, and together we can make sure no one ever has to fight alone.